Hello again everyone, welcome back to another video of this Caro Kann series. I think it's been a long time since we put something together for this series, so I want to spend some time, just to show this playlist a little bit of love and also updates for everyone to use later in the game. And so without further ado, let's just go ahead. In the very last video of the Caro Kann series, we talk about how black wants to play pawn to c5 in his variation. This is carls-botvinnik with the early c5 break. We also discussed that this opening is not really looking for major advantage right off the bat, but rather to look for simple development move after white captures on c5 and we play e6, preparing to just capture the pawn on c5 with our bishop. Now as with the Queen's Gambit decline line, Caro Kann offers the same pattern in which, if white plays pawn to b4 in this position, then we play pawn to a5, trying to break up whatever there is on the queen side. If you're a long-time Queen's Gambit player, you will know that this particular pattern and structure on the queen side is not sustainable in the long term, and so protecting the pawn on c5 is a bad idea. Obviously, if you go pawn to a3, you go pawn takes b4, pawn takes b4, this rook on a1 will be hanging on a1, and so that's no good. But if you place pawn to c3, we still take. This happens in the Queen's Gambit decline line as well. And then we play pawn to b6. Surprise, surprise, after pawn takes on b6, we take on b4, there is check. This b6 pawn will fall and they will have a fantastic opening with every pieces out. So normally we'll just see white give up this pawn with knight to f3 and such. We take our pieces and develop our pieces very quickly. But in a perfect world, this is nearly difficult to get, especially if you're intermediate level or beginner level. One after looking at this opening might have chosen to play something like pawn to c3. Just saying, well, I don't know what this opening is, I'm just going to solidify whatever that I have on the center of the board. I'm not going to change the structure of the board very quickly. And yeah, just come at me. See what you got, right? And I'm not going to lie, this opening is actually as frustrating as heck, especially if you're holding the black pieces, because the development is just not going to be as rapid anymore as if white captures on c5. But okay, we continue, right? As black, we can play knight to c6. Now white can do a immediate move, one of them knight f3, pawn takes c5, or even the engine move pawn to a3. But we'll see the most common response, which is knight to f3. Now just trying to hold everything together, right? So to speak. He's not going to capture for the rest of the game. But that's okay, but now we'll have to have a change of plans. Now in this position, I suggest we take the pawn on d4 and play bishop to g4. At this point, you're already not looking to play for the edge. Rather, you're looking to not lose out in the opening and seek opportunity to crush your opponent if he or she makes a mistake later on in the game. But let's look at the general plans of black, right? He has the c file open now, which means that the rook will generally come to c8 to control that file. You'll also notice that the diagonal to the king is open, so when he plays e6, the direct placement of the bishop will be on b4. Now white here can choose between the multiple moves, but let's just say he goes with the general plan, which is bishop to e3, protecting the pawn on d4. Then the same thing, we go e6, we have to develop. Then after knight to b2, we have bishop to b4 as advertised. Bishop to e2 is possible in this position, just finishing development, trying to castle. Then we go knight to e7, we're doing the same thing, we're trying to castle as well. And then surprisingly, the best point is to notice as well, if white plays pawn to a3, we can definitely capture the knight for the bishop. So in general, we don't want to do that, we don't want to trade our bishop for the knight, but because the position now is very close, there are pawns everywhere, the bishop is basically just a hindrance rather than a help in this position. Or rather in the whole opening. And so more often than not, you'll see players dealing a3 with just capturing the knight on d2. So in this opening, in this particular structure, the knight is better worth than the bishop. So let's just say if the queen takes on d2, we can go knight to a5. The target is b3 next move, but also we can go rook to c8, knight to c4, that kind of stuff. So just one of the possibilities. Okay, let's say white castles on the king's side. We go knight to f5. The bishop's ready to exchange themselves for the knights. And so if anything, we'll have inactive pieces versus not very active pieces, and we have the rook c8 coming soon as well. If anything, this is close to equality than more people might have expected. And from here on out, it'll be an ultra solid opening for black, and it'll be hard for white to get through. Now, of course, with that said, it's also just not easy to find a winning plan for black, but at least it is a way to go. Of course, with its active pieces as well, it is still going to be slightly easier to find a foothold when playing this against stronger opponent. But let's just go on a few more moves ahead, shall we? Let's say he goes rook to c1 in this position. We can always go queen to b6. Now we develop a piece again, attacking the d4 pawn very quickly. And this is where it gets interesting. If white challenged the knight with bishop to d3 attacking f5, we're not going to necessarily take on e3, although we can. But rather we're just going to castle, because after, let's say, bishop takes f5, In general, we're just okay, although we just said the knight is probably better than the bishop. White has lost a couple of tempo just to make this kind of capture. And for the placement of the bishop, suddenly we're controlling the long diagonal, so no queen to d3, there's no rook to c2 doubling up. And so this is probably going to be okay. Again, if he goes pawn to h3, there's an interesting tactic. We take on d2. Obviously, if bishop takes on d2, we take on f3, and this d4 pawn will hang because the bishop is not protecting any of those pawns. But if queen takes on d2, then we have bishop takes on f3. We wreck the structure on the king side, and this should be better for us as black as well. This pawn also hangs on d4. And so everything depends on the wellness of the d4 pawn, so white must be careful in this position. Now I won't go too far in depth in a sense, but I suppose you'll know how to actually develop from that moment on. And to be quite honest, it's not really that difficult. It'll be more of a hassle compared if white takes on c5, but the wall is not perfect and we just have to make use of it. But let's just say this time he goes bishop to e2 to continue, not bishop to e3. Then we go the same thing. Pawn to e6, we try and develop to b4, the bishop to b4 kind of stuff, knight to e7, turn a castle on the king side. The move that we talk about being bishop to b4 still works, but obviously since it's not checked, white is entitled now to play pawn to a3. Now this hits the bishop with tempo, the bishop has to move back, let's say to a5, we move it back to b6. This is still good because we attack the d4 pawn, we develop our bishop, nicely as quickly as possible, and it's an option to play. And if white develops with a normal bishop to e3, we can go knight to e7. We can even go bishop takes f3, bishop takes f3, they'll be fine as well. In general, it's trying to bring this knight to f5, and we'll have the similar position that we saw earlier on the variation. In fact, let's just put that out right now. Knight to e7, let's say if white plays knight to d2, definitely bring our knight to f5, attacking d4 twice. And if h3, we can definitely take that, and very quickly castle on the king side. And so this will be a normal position to play. We're always attacking d4, and if something happens with g4 or something, we takes on e3. So all is good. But I also want to recommend from my side, not going to be tempoed by your opponent, and also one of the very strong move, and that is queen to b6. Now this queen b6 move, as you can see, ignores whatever that is on the king side, and just say basically if you play bishop to e3, I'm going to capture on b2, this is possible. But again, just because you ignore everything on the king side, it makes this move slightly a bit dangerous to play if you don't know what you're doing. While in this position, instead of bishop to e3, continue with knight to d2, and we double like normal, play knight to e7, and say if white plays h3. I know we talk about bishop takes on f3, exchanging the bishop for the knight is possible, it's very nice as well. But in this position, I also want to recommend a double-edged move, a slightly dangerous one, and that is bishop to h5. So retreating the bishop, baiting him to play pawn to g4. Now let's say he plays pawn to g4, we go bishop to g6, and play pawn to h5. The thing is we have not castled yet, right? And so if he has played this kind of hook, in which he plays pawn h3, pawn g4 to weaken his king side, we're going to of course play pawn to h5 just to capitalize on the weakness on the king side. Of course, if this opens up, this favors black here on h8, because the rook's already there. It is on the original square, but because the h-file is open, now it's developed, attacking the king side. We can in the end choose to castle on the king side as well, or park our king in the center of the board, while trying to put our double rooks on the h-file, checkmate white. So this is an idea actually, this is an idea to play, albeit slightly dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, but also the one with more winning chances. Now I spent the last tens of minutes talking about the general main line for black in this position if white plays knight to f3, but what if white doesn't play knight to f3? Again, after we play knight to c6 that is. What if in this position he plays the engine move, pawn to a3? Then screw it, right? This pawn to e3 basically says I want to control the queen side, pawn to b4 in some good day, and just basically plays on the queen side. But okay, here we just develop like normal, right? We play bishop to f5. Obviously we can't play bishop to g4 because we just hang the bishop. And after knight to f3, we go pawn to e6. Just like normal, after bishop to e2, now we just go bishop to g4. Now why should we waste a tempo on this knight basically? Now first of all, white has lost the tempo itself on a3, and so we play bishop to g4, that's no problem. That's just giving his tempo back. The second of all, we just want a structure where we can place our knight on f5, and so the bishop on f5 is just a hindrance to do that. Moreover, in the current moment, it's not attacking anything. The plan with knight to b4 is also thwart with a3, and so it's not possible. So we play bishop to g4. Actually, it's a good thing for our bishop as well. We can then again place knight to e7 and play knight to f5 very quickly. Now, if the situation permits, of course. It is possible here to play the more absurd pawn to b4, but again, when we are placed in so much pressure, we try to exchange pieces off and look for equality very quickly. In this position, knight to e7 can be played, knight to g6, knight to f5, and so it's actually very fine for black to play in this way. Now the last line that we're going through is probably when white plays a sensible move like knight to d2. Then we're going to do the same thing with black in this position, which is pawn takes d4, pawn takes d4. We'll open up the c file again. And so in general, again, the file that's going to be open, the c file. That's the first file that you have to open as black to generate counterplay. And in this position, because you know that he's going to play b4, let's just go play pawn to a5. This stops pawn to b4 at the moment because of course the rook's hanging. It also just tries to gain as much space at the queen side as possible, and so there will be no queen to b4, for example. There will be no queen to b3, for example. And so this pawn to a5 move is a key, so to speak. It's a key to control whatever that is happening on the queen side. Whatever that white is planning on the queen side, we can thwart with pawn to a5. And so that said, most of the time you'll see white plays queen to b3 and or queen to a4. I think this is stronger, pinning down the knight to the king. Next move will be bishop to b5 of some sort, trying to maintain the control, the queenside control, excuse me for that. But either way, the queenside control with the bishop and the queen. So let's just move on ahead. Let's see what we mean by that. Knight to e7, for example. Then we see bishop to b5, placing more pressure on the pinned knight. The pinned knight cannot move, of course. So let's just say we can go queen to b6, but again, because the knight is pinned, it's not very comfortable for us. I'll recommend playing queen to d7. This is placing our queen not in direct attack, but still, for some people it's not recommendable, it's not very comfortable. But in general, you want to bring knight to c8 where it attacks the queen on a4 via b6 as the way to get out of that pin and that pressure on the queen side. So say the game continues like this, where white's playing nonchalantly, then we can play knight to c8 and also knight to b6 this move. There are many times as well when white tries to play knight to b3, trying to attack the a5 pawn after bishop to d2, but this does not work, right? Just play knight to c8, knight to b6, the queen is trapped here. Let's just see where it can go next move, right? So more often than not, bishop takes c6 is played just to alleviate some of the pressure on the queen side. Then we take our queen. This position will have been okay for us to go to. Not to mention we can take the knight here on f3. And yeah, just try to play normal chess. It doesn't really matter if the pawn is hanging right here, because you're going to get some counterplay in the center of the board. The king side is also kaput, so you can play bishop to e7 and rook to h8. To actually counter-attack on the king side as well. Your king, on the other hand, is also more developed in the center of the board and is ready to get into an endgame. Now, there is a very key idea that I want to show you very quickly before we leave. That is the idea of pawn to f6 in this position. Contrary to popular belief and what Benjamin Frankel used to say, never play f6. This opening is very important to play f6 because you want to free up the f file to open as well. Now, the f file currently is open only for white. Of course, we want to open it for black as well, so we can have an equality control. And also on the other hand, to just take away this e5 pawn that is being a thorn on black side, basically. And so, yeah, there's a position like that when, let's say, in this position, when white plays rook to d1, there's knight to c4. And in the end, you can play pawn to f5 or pawn to f6, just to challenge this pawn here on e5. And so there are positions like that where, black is really forced to play pawn to f5 or pawn to f6 just to maintain equality. But okay, this is basically the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed, hopefully you get something from this video that you can apply to your next game very soon. If there's any line that I'm missing, of course feel free to comment down below. Also direct message through one of my platforms is also very nice. In any case, if you learned something, please consider pressing the like button. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one.